Welcome to Inspire Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter Swoboda, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change. So in the last couple of podcasts I've been speaking about the whole issue of attachment, and especially attachment between parent and child, and what some of the sort of foundation elements are necessary in creating securely attached children and therefore teenagers and adults. And obviously in each developmental stage there's going to be different skill sets that are needed essentially to maintain that attachment, that connection between parent and child. But I also want to bring into play the whole issue between partners. And one of the biggest things that I very quickly learned when I started working as a couple therapist many decades ago, that as much as we believe that we're good at communicating often, the fundamental issue is that a lot of times we're missing the point. So a lot of people think that, it's really, really important to be able to articulate themselves really well. In other words, to speak well, good content and so on. Well, I'm going to challenge that notion a little bit. My suggestion is that one of the most fundamentally important aspects in having good contact, good connection with someone is the capacity to truly listen. And that means, in my terminology, or in psychological terminology, almost like a full body experience in a sense. Now, there's been some suggestions that all communication has a ratio of 7% of the spoken word, in other words, what we say, and about 93% of what is non-verbal, okay? So how are we going to translate that into listening? And, one of the things that I'm going to present in this podcast is essentially looking at what we mean by mindful listening and some suggestions on how we can actually practice that. I mean, good communication is fundamentally like any skill. It's understanding what that skill is about, being able to break it down, and then being able to implement it and evaluate it, getting an understanding of what comes out of it. In other words, what's the benefit of the process? So in this particular instance, the focus is on listening, not so much speaking. And it's also not necessarily focusing purely on empathy, but rather including it in a non-focused way at the moment. The real point of this whole approach is that we can create a situation in really hearing the other person's story, narrative, issue. Okay? So when we introduce the idea of listening, one aspect to it is the whole issue about mindfulness. So in other words, now let's expand this and go, okay, what we're going to be talking about is mindful listening. So what does that mean? We all, mindfulness at the moment is this big buzzword. It seems to come up everywhere, from psychotherapy to counseling, coaching, mentoring. Okay, but often it's seen as a sort of discrete exercise that we do once or twice a day where we are mindful. And as I've suggested in other podcasts before, to me, mindfulness is a very, very important aspect in all things that I do. The more mindfulness I can be in situations and in what I do, the more likely I am to be in touch with my being in the moment. Okay, and so that goes when I'm communicating with my partner, with my kids, grandkids, with my clients. It's an experience almost like I'm immersed in a sort of bubble wherein myself and the other person exists in close contact, not necessarily physical proximity, but definitely in an intentional, values-based way. So the definition of mindful listening is really completely listening to the other person. So, for instance, instead of interrupting the person and trying to tell one's own story or thinking ahead, the listener is fully present in this very moment of contact. One way of describing that is to talk about listening as though I'm over there with the speaker. Now that requires some, particular sort of sub-skills in a sense. The big one is about the capacity to self-regulate, in which my focus on myself is set aside. So one of the important things in that process is to be able to create an inner stillness wherein the speaker has the opportunity to feel free of the listener's preconceptions and prejudices. And the listener, on the other hand, is free of the inner chatter, the monkey inside all of us. We've released it, it's gone. So let me put that again in a couple of steps. So we need to be able to be mindful, so that requires some practice on its own. We need to be clear about what happens for me internally when I'm listening or attending, to be clear about what my intention in that is, and in this case it is to be still within, to not pay attention to my inner voices that might go off about what the other person's saying. Now, I know I'm repeating myself, but I want you to be really very, very clear in this process, because the next bit is going to be setting up a place where you and the chosen person that you want to practice this with have an opportunity to really exercise it, to learn from it. This is, again, we tend to go into the rights and wrongs of things and so on. This is about allowing both yourself and the other person that you're going to practice this with to evolve into being, attentive, intentionally attentive, mindful in your communication. And in another podcast, I'm going to be talking about mindful speaking. But in this one, I want to really just focus on that whole idea about mindful listening. And it's going to be an experiential thing. It's not just a cognitive thing. All right? So I'm going to make an assumption, and that assumption fundamentally is that you're going to practice this with your partner. Okay? Now, part of the intention of mindful listening is the capacity not only to attend to my partner and really hear them, but also to be able to translate that into children. Often when we communicate with kids and teens, we're actually so wrapped up, often with an issue about dominating them, controlling them, to get them to do what we want, that we're not actually paying attention to the emotional message that they're trying to convey. And sometimes they don't know exactly what that is either. I spend a lot of time both with couples, but with individuals and parents, to be able to get to a point where you can acknowledge and validate the emotional part of the communication, which means exercising some empathy. So let's get down to it a little bit. Okay, so basically what I want you to do is to, with your partner, is to sit down, make sure that you've got a quiet place in which to do this in, and then begin to each person, the speaker, to share something meaningful with the other person. In other words, invite your partner to think of something in their life that's been stressful or one thing that they're looking forward to. And it's a short exercise. So essentially, what I want you to do is in 1 to 2 minutes, share your insights with each other after the person's spoken. So one way of doing that is the speaker, and the listener have a signal so that we know when one stops and the other one starts. Okay? Now, one way to do it is that for the first instance, you have one speaker, one listener, and then that wraps the exercise. What some people do is they do one person is the speaker, the other person is the listener, and then they swap. Keep it simple, okay? But remember, after the exercise of mindfully listening, I want you to share with each other some insights, okay? Now, one of the things that is helpful in that is some questions that you can ask each other after the exercise. So, for example, how did you feel when you were speaking during the exercise? How did you feel when you were listening during the exercise? Did you notice your mind wandering? Were there distractions? Did you tune into those distractions? Did your mind begin to anticipate what the person was getting to? Were you judging while listening to the other person? Were there times when you did feel some empathy about the other person? Did you become aware of the strength of that empathy? So how did that feel in your body? How did you experience it? How did your body feel right before speaking? What about after speaking? Also, focus on what are you feeling then, right then and there, after the exercise, sitting with your partner. So, here's the proposition. Imagine practicing mindful listening with each person that you speak with. Do you think that would change the way you interact and relate with other people? Now, in this instance, I want you to focus then not just on your partner, but also imagine what this would be like communicating with your child or your teenager. Because one of the things that I get from a lot of teenagers is my parents don't listen to me. And the parents will say, yes, I am. But the reality is we're often too busy in our head trying to, deal with the problem, find solutions, and get, our kid to buy into the solution. Now, that's, sounds simple, but as most of us know, that is not as simple as it sounds. So it's a fundamentally important aspect in connecting. Now, one more question. How would you feel if you set that intention to pay attention to others with a sense of curiosity, kindness, acceptance to everything you said and everything you listened to? Would that really begin to create a difference in your experience of the other person and the relationship that you have together? Again, one of the complaints that I get from couples often, or one partner in a relationship, in a marriage or a partnership, is they go, I express what I feel and what I need, but then that gets lost in the conversation. And I don't know how to bring it back to where we really need to be in that dialogue. And so, we experience what's often been referred to as kitchen sinking. So especially if it's conflict, we start throwing all different issues at each other, and each person is there to get their point across, but they're not really listening to the other person. They're not getting to the point of acknowledging and validating what the other person's feeling and what has brought that issue to the point of conflict. So again, in conflict management, this is also really, really important. So that's a simple exercise that I thought I'd share with you because I think it makes a fundamental difference, especially when I've sat in sessions with couples who were locked in conflict. The capacity to bring to play mindful listening has been fundamentally important. And similarly, working with parents, to help parents get a better connection with their child or their teen is the capacity to be present. Let me come back to that point about the ratio between what's said and how we say it. The non-verbal stuff is really, really important. So my body attention, my body language in attending to that child or that teenager is probably more important than what I'm going to say. So until next time, I hope you have fun with that. I hope it brings forward some change, and I hope you embrace that change in a positive way. Now, sometimes in the beginning it's a bit more bumpy than at other times, but play around with it. It's certainly worthwhile. So until next time, this is me signing off. Take care.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Gunter Swoboda does individual and group coaching for men looking to grow. For more information on this and the global Making Good Men Great movement, check out goodmengreat.com to get into contact. If you have a topic for the show or would like to be a guest on the air, please email producers at miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda, Miranda, at noirtainment, noirtainment.com. Thank you, and always keep inspiring change.